of trade policy interventions, trade agreements, and regulations. And we see these things. We also see some excellent work done by TMEA and also done by our colleagues from ITC and places like that, working with women's empowerment groups, working with women to try and enable them to participate more fully in an inclusive economic growth path. But where we saw there is a bit of a gap is in responding exactly to the challenge that Professor Tabitha said to us so clearly before the break, is how do we try to ex ante, before we launch a trade policy, before we launch and sign a trade agreement, before we table regulatory frameworks and structures, how do we, before, in the design process, how can we try to ensure that such policy, such agreement, such regulation will have a gender equal impact? Therefore, in one stroke, they support inclusive economic growth and they support gender equity, and we now know that they reinforce each other. What we're going to do right now is we have asked Julia to start work on this kind of methodology for understanding the relationship between policy frameworks and regulations and gender impacts, and to try to work towards a kind of a methodology that will help us. We could apply it in the design stage of policy and regulation and see where and how we can ensure that gender objectives are well served. So what we're going to do now is Julia's briefly going to present this. Tabitha is going to give us a 30-second, no more comment. What we're going to do then is we're going to break into the 4 sectoral groups, because we've understood that these issues are very sector specific. So we're going to break into groups. So please join the group that you feel most represents your interest area and your skill area. We will have finance here, we will have ICT there, we will have transport here, and we will have, transport we've had, what have I missed? Tourism over there. Please go to the group that most clearly matches where you think you can make a contribution. And then let's talk about, in that group, what are the real gender issues? And we try to think about them, and we think about how gender equality can be achieved. What would be the kinds of policy engagements you would look for? And then we're going to apply that again later. Sorry, no such thing as a free lunch. You're here to work. Sorry. Okay, Julia, give us a brief summary.
This presentation is just a brief overview of the draft methodology that we have developed for ICTSD that is aimed to help regulators and policymakers, but also stakeholders in the policy and legislation process to better understand the gender differentiated outcomes of different policy, legislation, regulation, both in terms of how they're designed and how they're applied. There's sort of three areas that the methodology aims to look at. One is the basic policy and legal framework. So even though most countries have enrolled in some kind of international commitments around gender equality, a recent World Bank study found that 90% of countries that they surveyed had at least one law impeding women's economic empowerment. There is also the issue of customary laws, which even if the normal legal system is gender neutral, can serve as inhibitors to women's participation in the labor force and in particular sectors. There's also the aspect of how the legal and policy framework is applied. So often men and women, the regulation and policies and legislation, how they're managed and the compliance expectations around them have very different impact on men and women. And women, due to different barriers that they face, may struggle to comply with particular regulation. And then finally, the institutional arrangements within which policy and legislations are often defined are not very conducive to women's empowerment. They're often designed by organizations that are dominated by men, and existing public-private dialogues don't adequately represent women's voice in these processes. And finally, the lack of gender disaggregated data means that often policymakers are developing legislation or policy in sort of a gender-blind environment because they can't really understand the different impact that the regulation they're proposing will have on women because they simply don't have the data. So this is just the conceptual framework that was designed to develop the methodology. And I'll just go over it briefly. I think it might not be so clear on the slide, but it starts off with the concept of the gendered structure of the economy. And this relates to the formal and informal barriers that inhibit women's participation in economic life. These are both due to formal legal rights and entitlements that women might or might not have, but they also relate to social values, customs, norms that delineate women's role in economic life and what their responsibilities are in the household versus in the economy. And these barriers really structure how women participate in the economy, both in terms of the access they have to opportunities, in terms of jobs, in terms of access to information, access to networks, access to training and education, but also access to resources such as capital, land, skills, etc. All of these gendered outcomes of policy and legislation are really related to the imbalance that we observe between women and men in economic transactions, in institutions that govern the economy, and the policies and regulation that govern the economy. So it means that sometimes we observe laws and legislation that actually do have discriminatory provisions or gender bias in them. For example, requirements around having a man having a man in order with you in order to start a business. But also, even when we have gender-neutral laws, sometimes they will have a very different impact on women than they'll have on men, and legislators and policymakers have to understand this. And then, as I said, the other aspect is the limited voice that women often have in decision-making around policy and regulation. There's a lack of gender balance in both public and private organizations. Women struggle in terms of access to networks and lobbying, so their voice is not represented when policy is being designed or is being reviewed. Because public-private dialogue tends to be dominated often by a set number of business organizations, their voice often does not come through in those discussions. So the methodology that we have proposed consists of 4 steps. The first is around understanding women's role and status as entrepreneurs and wage workers in the service sector, and it can be applied to any particular industry within services. The second step relates to analyzing the formal and informal barriers that women face due to unequal rights and entitlements, but also due to social norms and values. The third step identifies specific laws, regulations, procedures, and business-related obstacles, and that how they are perceived differently by men and women. And the final step is around designing solutions that are culturally and politically appropriate, that involve women and link as much as possible with existing reform strategies. So the first step of the process is really around understanding where women are in the industry or in the specific sector. I think as the earlier presentation showed, there's often both vertical and horizontal labor segregation. So women might be more concentrated in lower skilled jobs. Likewise, women business owners might be more concentrated in the SME sector. So this step in the analysis really allows us to see where are women and how might they be impacted by different policies and legislation. The second step is around analyzing the informal and formal barriers that shape women's participation in the economy. They relate to women's access to land and property rights and how they might structure women's ability to open a business and operate a business in the formal economy. They also relate to women's access to finance and control over finance, which I think was raised by some of the participants as a key issue. It also relates to the differences that exist between women's access to education and literacy skills. And the time poverty issue, women often have various domestic responsibilities that they have to perform first before they can participate in economic activities. And this often limits their ability, for example, to comply with complex regulatory processes that take a lot of time, both in terms of being away from the family, but also being able to spend the cost of that time for their business. And then finally, how the cultural norms limit women's mobility and participation in economic and business activity. For example, are there issues relating to women being able to participate fully in economic life because of certain constraints on their mobility? How is a woman owning and operating a business perceived? How gender stereotypes might limit women's progress in certain industries, etc. And the final step of the analysis portion of the methodology is understanding the laws and regulations and obstacles and how they differently affect men and women. So firstly, looking at the main laws and regulations that govern the specific sector, and are there any provisions that are particularly discriminatory towards women? Sorry. Are there any gender biases in how the legislation or the particular policy was designed? The other questions concerned informal and formal barriers that were identified in the previous step. So how might they affect women's ability to access the opportunities that are awarded by particular legislation or policy, but also how might they make it difficult for women to comply? For example, various standards, compliance issues around food safety may make it very difficult for women restaurateurs to comply with this regulation, pushing them into the informal economy rather than operating in the formal economy. Then what sectoral constraints are perceived differently by women and men, and particularly what are the priority sectoral constraints for women and men? Often they're very different. And finally, are women excluded from the decision-making process or public-private dialogue mechanism that allow for the review of laws and regulation by private sector? And the final step in the methodology is around designing solutions that are appropriate, that involve women and link with existing reform strategies. I think that the final part is very important when these processes can link with existing strategies for the sector, for the economy, but also most countries have national gender strategies. So when these policies and regulation align best with these, that's when they have the most chance of success. And the other important aspect is really involving women in this process. They're best placed to define the solutions that will resolve the obstacles that they face in terms of participating in a particular sector, progressing in that sector, and really flourishing as business owners. So I've just put forward some broad recommendations on the type of solutions that might be put forward as part of the analysis. For example, when it comes to designing the legal framework for a regulatory and legal framework for a particular sector, developing a gender strategy for that sector that can inform new laws and legislations that are aimed to improve competitiveness of the industry. It's also around amending or supplementing existing sectoral laws and policies to correct any gender biases and repealing any particular regulation that is actually discriminatory of women. In terms of how regulation and policies are applied, for example, putting putting forward new institutional mechanisms that improve the accessibility and responsiveness of existing institutions to women. For example, things like one-stop shops for business registration that have longer opening hours can make it much more accessible for women to register their business and operate in the formal economy. Also setting and adopting sector targets for women's participation in government to business services, and also promoting, for example, licensing criteria in the ICT sector or the finance sector to give preference to women-owned companies or companies with women in top management positions. And around institutional arrangements, it's really around promoting women's role and voice in terms of government decision-making by training government staff, promoting government champions who can ensure that women's views are properly addressed in the decision-making and policy-making process. Strengthen partnerships between economic management ministries and ministries responsible for women and gender issues, and also work in conjunction with national bureaus of statistics to gather better data on where women are in the economy in particular sectors, and to develop better sex disaggregated statistics. And then finally ensuring women are adequately represented in public-private dialogue, for example, like Trademark is doing through the East Africa Women in Business platform, either by forming new women's business associations or ensuring that current business associations widen their membership. So I think that's it. And I think there's a draft of the methodology provided. And hopefully we'll get some really useful comments from you on applying this to your particular sector. Sorry about my voice.
Thank you very much, Julia. That was really, this is groundbreaking stuff. We know that nobody else is doing this. We're appealing to all of you for your participation in this process, your inputs, your guidance over the next 6 to 8 months as we finalize this. A brief provisional response from Tabitha, who's going to be working closely with us on this.
Thank you, Deborah, and thank you, Julia, for that very well presented and analyzed paper. And it actually captures the gist of the matter, because as I mentioned earlier before we went for break, that most of the time the laws that, the laws and policies that usually govern us, they are usually either gender biased, gender neutral, or the people who actually come up with the policies don't even know the impact of those policies on both men and women. So coming up with this methodology will actually help the policymakers, and that, whatever policies that they make, they impact differently on both men and women. And, the 30 seconds might be over, but Deborah, you just give me a minute. In Kenya, we have a very, very, very good constitution that says we should have a 2/3 gender rule. But it has been in parliament, because our parliament is actually male-dominated, and they don't see that it should be passed, that bill should be passed. Because to them, everything is okay. Men and women should compete, and that women should not be given any privileges, that women should not be helped to parliament or in boardrooms as managers or wherever. To them, it is very, very okay. So it goes to parliament, it's defeated, it's brought again, and seriously, you can see that we have people who are not gender sensitive. To them, everything is okay. And apart from that, our constitution is still very, very okay on inheritance, that women can actually inherit their parents' property. But the implementation part of it is actually a problem, because the men who are brothers and sisters, even some sisters are not gender sensitive, but the brothers usually see that whatever their parents have belongs to them. And so the women don't have any business inheriting their parents' property, or even as wives, you should not inherit your husband's property, so it should belong to if you didn't have a son, it goes to your brother, the brother-in-laws, or if you have a son, it is the son's name that shall appear in that title, whatever it is. So apart from actually working on the laws, we also need to sensitize people the implementation of those laws. Because it is one thing coming up with laws, but the implementation part of it becomes a problem because people are not aware. And we also need to start from the school level. Because if we have to have men and women who will contribute, who will participate in terms of skills development, in ICT, in engineering, or wherever, then we need to start at school level. The socialization of these children, we don't want to start with girls thinking that the best job that they can do is being a nurse, is being a teacher. That is a job that will actually work very, very well because it will not endanger their marriage. Because, they are brought up to believe that marriage is the ultimate. You can actually have your cake and eat it. You can have a marriage and also be an engineer. You can be, a pilot or whatever. But if we start by trying to show the girl child that the best you can do is being a wife, and you're being trained to be a good wife, for that matter, then you wouldn't want to have a skill that will actually become a barrier. Because that skill will actually be bothering you. So as long as you don't know that you have the qualities of an engineer, then it is good to be a nurse. It's good to be even a cleaner, although I don't think anybody would want to be a cleaner, but most of the cleaners we all know are actually women. And let me give you an example. I work at the University of Nairobi, and I also do a lot of consultancy with people in engineering. And you go to those buildings and you find one toilet for females. Now that toilet was actually had to be improvised because the whole building was supposed to be male only. Engineering. Because the way we are brought up is an engineer is supposed to be a man. So what we find there is even the females who are working there are working in a very hostile environment. If you're teaching there and there's one toilet and you're sharing that toilet with, everyone, surely women have got special needs. And those needs should actually be addressed. And apart from that, another example, we have girls who are doing very, very well in secondary school. They pass and they come to the university and they are admitted in engineering, civil engineering, mechanical engineering. But then we start having, they are admitted initially, but then they start dropping out and they transfer to the arts. They want to go and do sociology. They want to go and do education. Why? Because their boyfriends, who are in second year or third year, tell them, surely we cannot continue if you're doing engineering and I'm doing the arts because I'm a bit ashamed. When we work together and you are saying you are doing a very high degree and I'm doing, anthropology. So the girls usually transfer. The first 3 weeks, they usually transfer from those quote-unquote courses that would lead them to having those high skills that they compete very, very well. So we are saying, and this is a very, very good beginning, that we need to have laws, all right, but we also need to start right from the bottom. We need to start right from the bottom. We come up with a socialization method, even the books that we have, even the people out there, in Kenya we call them mashinani, out there in the villages. The parents don't actually they start showing the girl child that there is potential in them. There is potential in them, and as we grow, as they grow even themselves in their mindset, then this is actually going to translate into gender equality at the end, because these girls will actually compete very, very well. So Julia, this is a very, very good beginning. And apart from that, let me also mention, Kenya, we also have what we call a Women Enterprise Fund, because we are concerned with the woman who is in business. That is very, very good. But then you're supposed to be in a group. You're given 50,000 shillings in a group. If you are a group of 10, you're given 50,000 shillings for a business. How do you translate that into each person? So at the end of the day, the law is good, fine, because we are concerned with the women. But at the end of the day, we are actually confining the women's businesses into micro that will never grow. So even as we come up with these policies, we need to think beyond. Because as it were, on paper is very, very good. But we need to think beyond. What is the gender impact? Is it actually helping the women to make their businesses compete in the global market? We come up with liberalization policies. We come up with all these supermarkets that are, everywhere. And then that is killing the small businesses of the women. They're killing them because we did not think of the impact. We can still have the supermarkets, we can have all these businesses, but we can still make sure that the women's businesses are not killed. The small corner shop that belongs to the women, the woman out there doesn't close down. That even as the supermarkets grow, these women are also benefiting from the system that they're also growing. So my 30 seconds are over, but I would have gone beyond. But thank you, Deborah, and thank you, Julia, and I'm sure we shall take this paper to the next level. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tabitha and Julia. So we see in these comments and in Julia's presentation, there's a lot to think about as to how we can go about this. The whole issue of ex-ante socialization means what? It means how we think about participation in the process, as Julia raised. It means to think about what does it mean in terms of flanking policies. You can't address all of this through trade policy and regulation. We need to maybe think about the flanking issues. We may need to think about how implementation happens. That may need to be an issue. And we may need to think about, do we need positive discrimination or do we not, and what impact it will have. So what we're going to do now is everybody get to work, please. We will break into our 4 groups. Please take half an hour. Please just think through what are the specific issues for women, for gender equity in that sector, and how can it possibly come into something positive. So we will have here, please, finance. We will have ICT over there, please. We will have tourism over there, please. And we'll have logistics over here. So each group should have a leader to make sure logistics transport, Here. So each group should have a leader, please, and each group should have a note taker, please. Get yourselves in order because we're going to meet in 25 minutes again to do brief feedback. Thank you. I will come and help.